it's about time that we start to wake up and realize like these things are happening whether we want them to or not. And it's a matter of, can we get on the boat of actually accepting and navigating that and increasing our own awareness to understand what are those tells.
You don't have to suffer alone. And the less you talk about it, the more isolated you're going to feel, which is why these cycles just perpetuate over and over and over again. Because when you feel that alone, it's like, I have nowhere to turn. Hey, everybody, it's Bianca.
And it's Amelia.
Welcome to another episode of Evolve Ventures, where we're helping growth-minded humans evolve by breaking one limiting belief at a time. We hope you enjoyed the last episode, number 269, Motivation Monday, 3 ways to make fitness fun. For today, number 270, why we engage in self-harm. So, little disclaimer, this is going to be a little bit of a heavier episode. In all honesty, I have not seen another podcast ever do an episode about a topic like this. So this is a first, unless I'm mistaken, and I hope that I am. I hope other people are talking about this because this is a lot more prevalent than I think we want to believe. And this is a topic that really needs to be talked about, not just from a clinical perspective, but from a human perspective. The reason I wanted to do this was because there are far more of us engaging in self-harm than we realize. And I made a TikTok and a Instagram reel about this. It'll have been a couple of months ago at this point. But I was talking in that video about self-harm isn't only what we typically jump to when we think of self-harm. So it's not just like cutting or burning or other really self-mutilating behaviors like that. Self-harm can look like many things. And that's what we're going to be diving into today. So number one, what is self-harm and why do we engage in it? And then number two, how do you start to get out of it? What do you do instead when you start having the feelings of wanting to hurt yourself and wanting to engage in those behaviors? So that's really what we're going to be diving into today. Do you have anything to add before I start diving in?
Yeah, I actually, based on the point that you had mentioned, the prevalence, I want to pull in some stats. And what we're really talking about when it comes to self-harm, you might have come across this as NSSI, non-suicidal self-injury. Self-injury, to kind of just continue what you're saying there, it looks very different from what we initially think it might be. And it's a lot bigger of an encompassing umbrella term than I think a lot of us want to really admit, because I know, like you put in the disclosure there, like this is a really difficult thing for us to understand emotionally. And I think that intellectually we can understand it a little bit better than emotionally. But from a statistics standpoint, the lifetime rates of populations for adolescents and young adults just on its own is 15 to 20% in terms of relevance. And usually those behaviors start around 13 to 14, if my memory on the stats confirm. And we can put the resources to that in the show notes, because I want to make sure when we talk about this, we also equip our listeners with resources to really understand what we're talking about on more than just a statistics and numbers level. But I think that those statistics and numbers are really critical to understand as a foundational baseline when we talk about this, so that we are understanding the importance of having these dialogues. Because I remember growing up and no one talked about this. No, it wasn't on anyone's radar, but yet the stats show that it's happening. So what do we do when things are happening and we don't talk about it? It gets left unaddressed. People don't get the help, the support, the understanding that they really need. And I know that I felt that way too at one point. So I think I just want to start there and let's get into it.
So I want to make a definition of self-harm that might be a little different than what like a typical textbook might see. And I'm generating this definition based on the clinical experience that I've had and what I've seen. So, in the context of what we're going to be talking about today, self harm is any behavior that you're engaging in that is causing substantial negative emotions and negative experiences and reactions in your life. So that can
Mhm.
look like anything. That can look like binge eating or restricting. That can look like actual self injurious or non suicidal self injurious behavior like cutting, burning, scratching, getting into fights. Um, that can look like spending time around people that you know negatively impact you. That can look like watching TV shows or engaging in content that you know are really destructive to your mental health and well being. So, self harm can look like many different things, but because none of us typically think about that and we don't usually categorize it as that, we don't think we're engaging in self harm. So, I will give a perfect example, and this client is where I want the reason why I wanted to do this episode. So, I have a client that I've been seeing for about 6 months now, and he came to me because we're both Middle Eastern, and he was like, "Oh my God, I think you can help me. I've never seen another Middle Eastern clinician before that I actually connected to." So I'm like, "Awesome, cool." So we've been talking and we've been doing a lot of trauma work. And he started telling me about some of the behaviors that he's been engaging in. And one of them has been masturbating and watching porn.
Yeah.
And he said, "I can't stop myself." And we were talking about it, and I was like, "Okay, well, what are you getting out of that?" So what I did was something called a functional analysis, which is basically I'm trying to understand the reasoning behind his behavior and what the function or the purpose of it is and how it's benefiting him. Because anytime we engage in a behavior, it's because it's giving us something. It is getting us something. Even if we're not consciously aware of it, it is
Mhm.
doing something for us. And self harm is the exact same thing. We are getting something out of it.
Mhm.
So I did a functional analysis and we're breaking it down. And I'm like, okay, what happens when before you're about to start masturbating? Okay, what happens when you start? Okay, when you're in the middle of it, what are you experiencing? Okay, right when you're about to climax, what happens? And he's like,
Mhm.
"Oh, well, I don't let myself climax." And I'm like, "Wait, what?" He's like, "Yeah, I do something called edging." And I was like,
Mhm.
"Oh, okay, I've heard of that." And I was like, "What do you get out of that?" I'm like, "Why do you do that?" And he started going into explaining, "Well, when I do that, it sends this massive surge through my body and it kind of hurts, but it also really distracts me from the fearful thoughts that I'm having and the negative internal dialogue that I'm having. And so
Yeah.
when I do that, it gets me out of pain."
Mhm.
And I'm like, "Bingo. That's why you're doing it. This is self harm."
Yeah.
And he's like, "What?" I was like, "Think about it. You're engaging in a behavior that's bringing you pain that you're controlling to get you out of this emotional pain that you don't feel like you have control over."
Mhm.
He was shook.
Yeah.
That's self-harm.
Yeah.
Think about how many times you found yourself scrolling through social media because you had negative thoughts or negative emotions come up that you didn't want to deal with. That's self-harm because you're introducing a new stimulus into your life that's distracting you. It's controllable pain. How many times have you gone for like a run or something because you wanted pain in that sense,
Mhm.
as opposed to whatever the pain it was that you were experiencing? That is self harm. So when we look at people who are engaging in the NSSI, the non suicidal self injurious behavior, like cutting, for example, anyone you ever talk to who says that they cut, they will tell you the exact same thing. Maybe not verbatim, but they will say the exact same thing. "This is pain I can control.
Mhm.
This pain, I'm doing it to myself. I am inflicting this on myself. So I have control over it.
Yeah.
So I get to start, I get to stop, I get to determine how deep I go, so on and so forth. I get to control this." It
Mhm.
gives me a sense of control because I don't feel like I can control my outside world. And that's usually what happens with people who are engaging in self harm. That is usually why people are doing it, because there's this pervasive feeling like I have no control over my life. There's so much pain. There's so much hurt. There is so much chaos happening around me, and I have no control over it. So I'm going to
Mhm.
gain control in whatever way that I can. And I don't want that pain. So let me give myself a different type of pain, because at least this one, I get to dictate it. I
Right.
get to do it. And it gives that sense of like certainty that at least something in my life is stable, even though it is massively destructive and is not actually fixing anything.
Yeah. So let's talk about like the risk factors. So like one of the things that I know for sure, it's the stressors and the risk fast factors, what you're just relating to right now, that increase the risk of those self-harm, non-suicidal self-harm behaviors, right? Self-inflicting behaviors. The one of the biggest things that I've seen is family breakdowns or conflicts, relationship difficulties, not feeling heard and understood by your family, knowing other people who self-harm and talk about the benefit that it brings them, right? One of the
Yeah.
things is being bullied when you're younger and in that time frame, like when you're being bullied and people are not like your social tribe is not really like accepting you, there's usually like a cry for help when it comes to this component, because that cry for help or that sense of control when you're engaging in those self-harm behaviors, that's a step above trying to really work with the complex difficult emotions that are accepting a world where the people that you thought were friends actually aren't being friendly or kind to you, or accepting and living and coping in a world where you don't have a family that has emotional intelligence to where they can actually provide a safe space for you to talk about the things that you're going through. The really, really difficult things. Alcohol, drug abuse, past trauma, neglect, or abuse, all of those are factors or things that can further induce stress. And that's why one of the things is when you start to kind of think about like the holiday season, right? That's a huge stress inducer for a lot of people, because you have revisiting old family wounds, trauma, neglect starts to come up, and all of these things around the holidays, all of that stuff starts to rise up, and people are trying to emotionally cope with that. I know a woman who at the time she was a young girl, but she, because her family had such body dysmorphia and they had such a difficult time accepting different body types. If you weren't flat, skinny, all these things, and her friend group was the same thing, perpetuating that narrative. If you weren't this, then you don't belong. She would literally wrap herself in belts and essentially create a corset of belts to the extent where she couldn't breathe. Yeah. So like self-harm in this non-suicidal self-harm, it can look so different based on who you are, what you're going through, what you're growing through. And that's one of the things that we just want to continue to share and spread light, spread awareness around, because you might not initially think that what you believe is self-harm. You might have never considered something like that, what Bianca you just talked about, as self-harming behaviors. And what are the things that are, number one, catalyzing that, right? The lack of control that someone might feel in their own life, or the lack of family conflict, right? Or the overindulgence in family conflict, right? Those stress inducing risk behaviors perpetuate these openness of needing that sense of control and those behaviors that therefore are engaged in. And I know what that feels like. You know, I've been there, and it's really difficult when you do not have a safe space to talk about it, when you do not have family, friends, people around you who you can engage with those safe conversations to help you remove the barriers that are that could be there to help you overcome this non-adaptive coping mechanism, these behaviors for you, you know. And I just don't think that we're, as a society, as aware of what it looks like, what it feels like, what the implications are, what induces it. And
Yeah.
likewise, like, how do you not also pathologize someone or like deem them less than, or that something's wrong with them from engaging in that? Because that's something that I see, the narratives of people who have engaged in self harm. They think they're bad, they're wrong, they're XYZ, right? Slap a label on it. And that further induces the narrative that then increases the risk factor to perpetuate that behavior. And I think that that's something too that maybe we could talk about a little bit.
When you're on a journey of self-discovery or self-rediscovery, it's very important to have a support system in place. And that's where a group like Evolve comes in, with their acceptance and advice and different people from different walks of life who can offer different perspectives for you to help you find your self-worth and aid in your journey of wellness. It's important and essential.
Yeah. Because self-harm doesn't just look like what we had said. So it doesn't just look like cutting, burning, whatever. We don't typically notice it in other people. And then you see someone who takes their own life and it's like, oh my God, wait,
Yeah.
what? I
How did
never
that
would have
happen?
suspected it. I never would have thought it. What happened?
Yeah.
The thing is, so many people are suffering in silence and they're engaging in behaviors that you don't know, of. And the statistics show that the longer you're engaging in self-harm, the higher probability that you start to engage in more injurious behaviors the longer you do it. And the
Yeah.
longer you do it, the higher risk you have of actually attempting to take your own life.
Right.
So someone who ends up taking their own life, they've probably been thinking about it for a really long time and then started engaging in self-injurious behavior and then started idealizing it and planning it out and looking up content around it.
Mm-hmm.
And then more and more and more and more. And the more exposure you get to it, the more desensitized you get to it. So the more, what's another word for desensitized? Like the less
Habitualized.
scary, yeah, the more habitualized you become to it, it feels more normal.
Yeah.
So then when it feels more normal and you have less fear around it, you're
Yeah.
more likely to make an attempt.
Well, there's
This
actually
is why self-harm,
oh, sorry, keep going.
it's okay. This is why self-harm is so dangerous. There's no such thing as safe self-harm.
No.
Now, one of the things that as a clinician I will do with a client is something called harm reduction.
Mm-hmm.
So and again, this might sound kind of alarming, but there is data to support this. If someone is engaging in like really drastic cutting, for example, harm reduction would be how can we minimize the risk?
Yeah.
So if you're cutting close to an artery, maybe go somewhere else, like on your shoulder or something, right? I know that sounds drastic, but the goal is to eventually get you to stop.
Mm-hmm.
But if that doesn't feel possible for you right now, okay, how can we make it less damaging and less damaging and less damaging and then transfer the behavior into something else that is maybe more adaptive, like talking to somebody or seeing a therapist or doing some other type of behavior like going for a walk or whatever, so that hurting yourself stops feeling like the only option. Because guys, I know if you are engaging in this, number one, you are not alone and there's not something wrong with you. You're clearly hurting
Yeah.
and you're in pain. So, number one, you're not alone. And number two, there are other methods to get out of pain that don't involve hurting yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to suffer alone. And the less you talk about it, the more isolated you're going to feel, which is why these cycles just perpetuate over and over and over again. Because when you feel that alone, it's like, I have nowhere to turn. I have no one to go to. And I must be the problem. So let me eradicate it.
Yeah.
If I'm the problem, let me fix it by hurting myself. Because at least now I have some sense of control. It's like,
Yeah.
that's not the answer.
Truth.
That's not the answer. There is always something that can be done. Sometimes it just takes, actually, always, it just takes reaching out to somebody and getting help.
Mm-hmm. There, there's theory that was really alarming to hear, but I understand it. And I want to share some of the research underneath that like self-harming behavior can actually become addictive because of
Yeah.
the neurochemistry that's involved. And I understand it from an objective standpoint now, but also looking back at my past experience of like the self-harming behaviors that I had engaged with when I was younger, from cutting to eventually like it was very toxically evolving into different types of drug or alcohol abuse, and like for
Mhm.
my own standards. And looking back now, I can understand and connect the dots, but like one of the biggest reasons why that continued and why that didn't stop was because I didn't know there was someone out there that could help me, or there was someone that actually wouldn't look at me like I was a monster, or wouldn't think that there's something wrong with me, or just try to prevent it from stopping, instead of actually hearing like what's underneath that, what's causing that, because it's not necessarily the cause. Let's look into and dig into the cause of why this is the only way out for you right now from your emotional experience. And I think it's really, really critical to understand that if you're listening to this and you are in that space, that you aren't alone and that there is support for you. And it's knowing that, but also like making sure that you like hear that on an emotional level. Because I know for me back then when I was a teen, like I did not feel like that was true. Like there was no evidence to support that. And as things progress, you know, it's like you start to realize that looking back, you wish you never did that to the past version of yourself, you know. And maybe you're a parent listening to this right now, and maybe this episode is really difficult for you. You know, I talk to some people that are Gen Xers and boomers that have a really difficult time with mental health and not pathologizing it and not making it like something's wrong with someone if they're engaging in some of these behaviors, right? Accepting
Yeah.
and loving and trying to work on this. And I think that if you're someone that's in those generations, or maybe you haven't had a family history that is like pro mental health, really okay talking about it and really okay thinking about some of these things, then this conversation will be hard for you. And I think that it's about time that we start to wake up and realize like these things are happening whether we want them to or not. And it's a matter of, can we get on the boat of actually accepting and navigating that and increasing our own awareness to understand what are those tells, right? Because we had someone in our community reach out, you know, going through a really hard time. One of their child like actually tried to attempt suicide, and it's after that we get so shook up, but the signs are there. And I really do believe it's our responsibility to really educate ourselves on what are those signs and what do they look like, instead of having the pathologizing of like how would that impact our own family system self-image if XYZ were to happen, right? Like be less concerned about that and more concerned about educating yourself, being more aware, having safe space conversations to really talk about this stuff, because it's not going to get better. It's going to get worse before it gets better. And so I really do believe strongly in what we're saying and how important this topic is to talk about.
The less you talk about it, the more stigmatizing it becomes. And this is why people would just rather suffer in silence than talk about it, because these topics are really taboo.
Mm-hmm.
I guarantee it's why I haven't seen any other show talking about these things, because it is so scary. And when there's someone in your life who is engaging in this behavior and you have no idea what to do, it's like it's terrifying. It's terrifying feeling like you can't help this person. It's terrifying feeling like you have no control. And it is easier to just avoid it and not talk about it than it is to actually look it in the face and say, okay, what's going on? What's
Yeah.
wrong? What is happening here?
What's
The
happened?
less we, right, the less we talk about these things, the worse they are going to get. So the more awareness we can bring to these topics, the more people will feel like they're not alone and the less likely they are to engage in these behaviors. Like if I had someone growing up who I really felt safe talking to, I probably wouldn't have engaged in self harm either.
Same. Facts. I know that 100%.
Like I wouldn't have cut myself. I wouldn't have gotten into the really destructive relationships I was in. I wouldn't have engaged in a lot of the other self-harming behaviors that I engaged in if there was somebody that I felt safe enough to go to and say, I'm really struggling, I'm scared, and I feel alone, and I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
But I didn't have that. Nowhere. I didn't have it at school. I didn't have it at home. So I was alone by myself trying to figure this stuff out.
Same.
And I knew if I tried to talk to my family about it, I would just get in trouble.
Oh, yeah.
So it's like, I'm not going to talk about this.
Right.
So for those out there who are engaging in these behaviors, and again, it's not just cutting and burning and whatever. Are you engaging in reckless behavior, like reckless driving, or doing really risky behavior, like really hyper promiscuous behavior and being unsafe about it? Are you staying in relationships that you know are destructive and that are hurting you? Are you excessively drinking or using substances? And the cutting and whatever. If this is you, if you are engaging in these behaviors, again, I can't emphasize this enough. You are not alone. You are not alone. There are people out there who want to help you, who can help you, and there is a way out of it. You just have to ask. And
Mhm.
Amelia and I are those people. Amelia and I never like really say, hey, no, you really should come to us when it comes to this. We'll suggest it, but like I am saying this full heartedly. If this is something you are struggling with, please reach out to Amelia or I because we will be able to help you with this.
Yeah.
Number 2, if you are the loved one of somebody who is engaging in these behaviors or you're concerned is engaging in these behaviors, please do what you can. Number 1, to educate yourself. And to number 2, do not be afraid to talk to them about it so they can get the help that they need.
Mhm.
Because your fear, and I know this is going to sound drastic, and this is not to blame you, this is to make you aware. Your fear could be the thing that makes this person take their life.
Mm.
Because if they know you're too afraid to have this dialogue, they might not come to you and they might end up just trying to complete suicide because it's easier than talking about it.
We said that this was going to be a heavy one, and it is a heavy one, but I'm grateful that we have the courage to talk about this because we see the other end of when people attempt, when people try, when people are going through these experiences and they feel literally so alone and they only feel as though they can talk to us. And, I think that that's a call to action for all of us to create a more empathetic space in our families, in our social systems, and really educate ourselves around mental health awareness, and really not pathologize it, really not think something's wrong with them. If, there's a wonderful video that I'll shout out Adam Sandler right now. Watched it recently, and we'll probably be watching this as the first movie at Evolve Movie Club, Leo. And it's about how, fifth graders are transitioning out of school, and like there's this class pet that's a chameleon, and he gets taken home by all of the kids. And I won't spoiler alert it, but he learns what all the kids are going through. But yet their parents have no idea because no one actually has the courage to talk about this stuff. What each and every single kid is going through, the insecurities, the challenges, the risks that are increasing their self-harm behaviors, what their fears, all of that. There's no safe space. And Leo, the chameleon, is the only safe space that they have. And the message, the through line through this movie, which I think is so critical, and I'm excited for it to catch fire, is that just having a safe space to talk about what you're going through is so critical. And that can save a life, right? That can save a life. And that's so real. And we know that because we live and breathe by that. And we have ever since we were younger, because we know what the other end of that looks like as well. So whether you're going through it, you're the person going through it right now, or whether you're someone who loves someone and or you might have feelers or sensory acuity to the fact your intuition is telling you something's up here, something happened, and I want someone to get help. Really advocate for that. having the courage to advocate for that is way more important in the now than having the regret after. So I just want to call to action everyone, because we can be the hero in our own journey, and we can definitely be the guide in someone else's. So that's my final takeaway.
Please reach out for help. You do not have to go through this alone. All right. And what is your episode suggestion?
My episode suggestion is 248, how to break toxic patterns in your life. You?
210, are you needy or have you just been neglected? All right, everybody. Heavy hitter, but these conversations need to be had. Because like we said, if we avoid these topics, we're just inflicting more harm. So the more awareness we can have, the more likely it is that we can help somebody else, and that you can get help if you're the one struggling with this. So please reach out. You are not alone. And we will see you next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.